The thermometer outside Arvid Lund's cabin read -43 degrees, and inside were 11 neighbors huddled around a fire no larger than a cooking flame. The air held steady at 65. Through the frost-covered glass walls surrounding his log structure, those who had mocked him for 18 months now pressed close to his innovation, silent and alive. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity speak to you, subscribe now, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The blizzard had been raging for 37 hours when Halvor Dahl finally admitted his cabin was killing his family. The wind screamed across the Montana Valley with a sound like tearing metal, driving snow horizontal through air so cold it burned exposed skin in seconds. Inside the Dahl cabin, despite a fire-consuming wood faster than Halvor could feed it, ice formed on the interior walls. His children huddled under every blanket the family owned, and still they shivered. The cabin, built using methods passed down through generations of frontier settlers, was failing. 300 yards across the clearing, Arvid Lund sat alone in his cabin, feeding his fire one small log every 2 hours. The temperature inside his structure held at 65 degrees. He wore a single wool shirt. The plants growing in the soil beds between his cabin walls and the outer glass enclosure showed no signs of frost damage. Through those transparent walls, he could see the storm that was freezing his neighbors, but inside his innovation, winter had no power. The glass and metal structure surrounding Arvid's cabin glowed like a lantern in the white darkness. The greenhouse shell extended 8 feet beyond his log walls in every direction, creating a transparent buffer that trapped warmth with an efficiency that defied everything the valley's settlers understood about survival. The metal framework supporting hundreds of glass panels formed a geometric pattern of dark lines against the snow, and the peaked glass roof mirrored the cabin's roofline but rose 3 feet higher, creating an insulated airspace above. Arvid heard them before he saw them. Voices carried strangely through the storm, distorted by wind but unmistakably human. He moved to the outer glass wall and wiped condensation from a panel. Through the driving snow, he made out shapes approaching. 3 figures bundled against the cold, stumbling through drifts that reached their waists. They were headed directly toward his structure. He recognized Birgit Dahl first. She carried her youngest child wrapped in blankets. Her 2 older children followed, clinging to her coat. They reached the outer glass door, and Arvid could see Birgit's face through the panel. Her lips were blue. Ice crusted her eyebrows and hair. She didn't knock. She simply stood there, waiting. Her children pressed against her. Arvid opened the outer door. Warm air rushed out into the freezing night, creating fog that swirled around the Dahl family. Birgit stepped into the space between the glass walls and the cabin itself, into the planted area where herbs and cold-weather vegetables grew in raised beds. The temperature here was 40 degrees, cold compared to the cabin interior but tropical compared to the storm outside. The children gasped at the relative warmth. Birgit met Arvid's eyes. No words passed between them. 18 months of mockery, of Halvor calling this structure a widow's folly, and Arvid a fool, wasting money on glass that would shatter at the first hard freeze. All of that hung in the air, unspoken. Arvid simply opened his cabin door and stepped aside. Birgit and her children entered the main structure, where the fire burned small but sufficient, where the air was warm enough that Birgit began unwrapping her youngest immediately, checking for frostbite. More figures appeared in the storm. 2 years earlier, Arvid Lund had been a different man. January 1882 found him content in ways he had not thought possible after the war. His cabin was modest, built in 4 days, using standard notched log construction. His wife Sigrid moved through their small space with efficiency born of frontier practicality. They had been married 3 years. She was 26. He was 32. The war that had made him a sharpshooter felt distant, almost unreal in the quiet rhythms of their life. The cold snap came without warning on January 14th. Temperatures that had hovered near 20 degrees plummeted overnight. By morning, the thermometer read -15. By afternoon, -28. Sigrid had promised to help Birgit Dahl with a difficult birth. The Dahl cabin was only half a mile away, an easy walk under normal circumstances. Sigrid bundled in her heaviest coat and left mid-morning, expecting to return by early afternoon. The temperature continued falling. Arvid kept their fire burning hot, consuming wood at a rate that concerned him but seemed necessary. The cabin's chinking, moss, and mud packed between logs had dried and cracked over the summer. Cold air found every gap. He could feel drafts moving through the space despite the roaring fire. By mid-afternoon, with the interior temperature struggling to reach 45 degrees, he began to worry. Sigrid should have been home. Even if the birth had complications, Birgit's husband Halvor would have sent word or escorted Sigrid back, given the extreme cold. Arvid pulled on his heavy coat and headed toward the Dahl cabin. The wind had picked up, driving the cold through his layers. His face burned. His lungs ached with each breath. He found Sigrid 200 yards from their cabin. She had collapsed in the snow, apparently trying to make it home. The cold had taken her quickly. Arvid carried her body back to their cabin and laid her on their bed. He sat beside her through the night, keeping the fire fed, understanding too late that the cold that had killed her had been inside their cabin too, waiting. If she had made it home, would the cabin's meager warmth have been enough? He would never know. He buried her 3 days later when the ground thawed enough to dig. The minister, Edvard Strand, spoke words about God's will and eternal rest. Arvid heard none of it. He stood at the graveside thinking only about temperature, about the specific degrees at which human bodies failed, about structures that promised shelter but delivered only partial protection, about gaps in logs and inadequate chinking and fires that consumed cords of wood yet barely kept interiors above freezing. The other settlers offered condolences. They brought food. They spoke of tragedy and acceptance. Arvid thanked them mechanically, but something had shifted in him that went deeper than grief. He had spent 3 years in the Union Army learning to kill men from distances they never saw coming. Now he would spend whatever time remained learning to defeat. Cold with the same precision. Arvid Lund had been 17 when he enlisted in the Union Army in 1861. He had grown up in Wisconsin, son of Norwegian immigrants who farmed marginal land and spoke English with thick accents. The war seemed distant until it arrived at their doorstep in the form of recruitment officers offering steady pay and purpose. Arvid joined, expecting to carry a rifle in formation like the other farm boys. His commanders discovered quickly that he possessed unusual visual acuity and a temperament suited to solitary work. By 1862, he was attached to a sharpshooter unit. They gave him a Sharps rifle and taught him to read wind and calculate distance. He learned to control his breathing and squeeze triggers between heartbeats. He learned to wait motionless for hours and to kill men who never knew he was watching. The work required patience and precision. It required accepting isolation. It required disconnecting the act of shooting from the reality of what the bullet did when it arrived. He was good at it. By war's end in 1865, he had confirmed kills numbering in the dozens, possibly more. The Army discharged him in 1866 with an honorable record and a mind that could not fully return to civilian normalcy. He drifted west, taking work as a hunter and guide. The skills that made him an effective killer translated well to tracking elk and reading terrain. But the isolation that had been useful in war became a burden in peace. He met Sigrid in 1878 in a settlement near Fort Benton. She was a widow herself, her first husband killed in a logging accident. They recognized something in each other, a shared understanding of loss and the necessity of moving forward despite it. They married within 2 months and established their homestead in the valley that would later bear scattered cabins of Norwegian and Swedish settlers seeking distance from eastern crowding. For 3 years, Arvid had been almost happy. The nightmares from the war diminished. His hands, trained to steadiness for shooting, learned to work wood and tend animals. Sigrid never asked about his war service beyond the basic facts, and he never offered details. They built a life measured in small domestic accomplishments, a successful harvest, a well-built shed, a winter survived together. Now Sigrid was gone, and the skills that had kept Arvid alive through war reasserted themselves. The same focus he had brought to eliminating distant targets now fixed on a different enemy. Cold was predictable. Cold followed physical laws. Cold could be measured, understood, and defeated through proper engineering. Unlike human enemies who acted unpredictably, temperature responded to specific interventions: insulation, thermal mass, radiant barriers, air gaps. Arvid began studying his cabin with the same attention he had once given to battlefield terrain. He noted every draft, every cold spot, every place where his fire's heat escaped into the night. He measured temperature differentials between interior and exterior. He calculated how much wood he burned per hour to maintain livable conditions. The numbers told a clear story. Standard cabin construction was grossly inefficient. The structure that had killed Sigrid through inadequacy could be improved, but incremental changes would not be sufficient. What was needed was a completely different approach. Spring 1882 brought thaw and the overwhelming silence of a cabin meant for two people. Arvid worked his trap lines mechanically, harvesting beaver pelts that would bring cash in town, but doing so without the purpose that had previously driven him. The money had mattered when he was building a future with Sigrid. Now it was simply something to do while his mind worked on the problem of thermal retention. He began traveling beyond his immediate area, ostensibly checking distant trap sets, but actually examining how other settlers built their structures. He noted cabin construction in a dozen locations. All followed similar patterns: notched logs, mud chinking, single-wall construction, minimal attention to foundation or roof insulation. Some cabins were built more carefully than others, but the fundamental approach was identical. None would have saved Sigrid. In early April, following a creek drainage 15 miles from his homestead, Arvid discovered an abandoned farmstead. The cabin had collapsed partially, its roof caved in from snow load. But beside the ruined cabin stood another structure that stopped Arvid in his tracks. It was a greenhouse, or had been. The frame was metal, rusted but intact. Most of the glass panels had shattered, but a few remained, and Arvid could see how they had been installed. The structure was perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, designed to extend the growing season for vegetables. Arvid spent 2 hours examining the greenhouse. He studied the metal corner, joints, and how the frame distributed weight. He looked at the surviving glass panels and how they had been sealed. He noted the foundation, simple but effective, and the peaked roof design that would shed snow. The greenhouse had failed not because of design flaws, but because no one had maintained it after the farm was abandoned. With care, such a structure could last decades. Walking back to his cabin that evening, an idea formed that seemed initially absurd. Greenhouses trapped heat during the day through solar gain. That heat warmed the air inside and was absorbed by soil and plants, which released it slowly at night. The principle was well established for extending growing seasons. But what if that principle could be applied not to plants but to a cabin? What if a cabin could be enclosed within a greenhouse structure, creating a thermal buffer between the living space and the exterior cold? The concept violated frontier common sense. Glass was fragile. Metal framework was expensive and heavy. The labor involved would be enormous. No one built this way because it seemed wasteful and impractical. But Arvid's mind, trained to calculate trajectories and account for variables others missed, saw the physics clearly. A cabin surrounded by a glass envelope would benefit from solar heat gain during the day. The airspace between cabin and glass would act as insulation. The thermal mass of soil and plants within that space would store and release heat. Wind which stripped warmth from cabin walls through convection, would be blocked entirely. He began sketching designs that night, working by firelight with charcoal on flat pieces of birch bark. The calculations were complex but manageable. He would need substantial amounts of glass and metal framework. He would need to engineer foundations that could support the additional weight. He would need to solve problems of access, ventilation, and structural integrity. But it was possible. The more he calculated, the more convinced he became that this approach could create a living space that remained warm, with minimal fuel consumption even in extreme cold. Summer 1882 became a season of methodical scavenging. Arvid had identified 7 abandoned homesteads within a 30-mile radius of his cabin, all showing signs of failed agricultural ventures. The pattern was common on the frontier. Optimistic families arrived with Eastern farming methods, discovered that Montana soil and climate defeated their techniques, and departed, leaving behind whatever was too heavy or worthless to transport. Greenhouses, built with hope for extended growing seasons, became the detritus of those failures. Arvid began with the closest site, the collapsed farm he had discovered in April. He spent 3 days carefully removing intact glass panels from the greenhouse frame. Each panel measured approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, held in place by metal clips that had rusted but remained functional. He wrapped each panel in burlap and straw, then loaded them into his wagon. 12 panels survived intact from that first site. He transported them home and stored them in his cabin, stacked carefully against the wall. The second site yielded 19 panels. The third site, a farm abandoned so recently that the cabin door still hung on leather hinges, provided 23 panels and sections of metal framework that could be reused. Arvid worked alone, camping at distant sites for days at a time. The work was physically demanding. Glass panels, while not individually heavy, became burdensome when transported in quantity. Metal framework required cutting with a hacksaw he had purchased specifically for this purpose, then loading pieces that weighed 30 to 40 pounds each. By mid-July, his collection included 78 intact glass panels and enough salvaged metal framework to construct corner posts and basic support beams. But calculations showed he needed at least 120 panels to enclose his cabin completely. The remaining abandoned sites were farther away, requiring journeys of 2 or 3 days each direction. Arvid made these trips anyway, driven by the clarity of purpose that had replaced his grief. Other settlers noticed his activity. Halvard Dahl encountered Arvid loading glass panels at an abandoned homestead 12 miles from the valley. Halvor asked what possible use glass had for a trapper. Arvid explained his plan to build a greenhouse around his cabin. Halvor stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. The sound was not cruel, simply incredulous. Glass would not keep a man warm. Glass shattered in hard freezes. The whole idea was madness born of isolation and grief. Halvor rode away, shaking his head, and by that evening the story had spread through the small community. The mockery began gently at first. Ivar Solberg, the carpenter, mentioned to others that Arvid was building something strange with glass. Thomas Hewitt, who operated a small sawmill, joked that Arvid was constructing a tomb for his dead wife. The widow's folly, they called it. A grieving man wasting time and money on an impossible project. But Arvid continued his salvage missions undeterred. By late August, he had 134 glass panels stored in and around his cabin, and enough metal framework to begin construction. The mockery would intensify. He knew that and did not care. Torsten Vick operated the only blacksmith forge within 20 miles of Arvid's valley. He was a broad man, 43 years old, with forearms thick from decades of hammerwork and a face weathered by forge heat. He shod horses, repaired wagon wheels, and fabricated simple iron goods for settlers who needed tools they could not purchase in distant towns. When Arvid approached him in early September with drawings and specifications for custom metalwork, Torsten's first response was refusal. The project Arvid described required precision that Torsten rarely attempted. Corner posts needed to be exactly 9 feet tall, with mounting brackets positioned at specific intervals. Horizontal beams required slots and pins for connecting vertical supports. The roof framework demanded angled joints that would distribute weight evenly across the structure. Torsten examined Arvid's drawings, done in charcoal on scraped hide, and recognized immediately that this was not casual work. This required engineering accuracy beyond typical frontier fabrication. Arvid explained the thermal envelope concept. Torsten listened without interrupting, his expression skeptical but attentive. When Arvid finished, Torsten pointed out obvious problems. Glass panels would crack from temperature stress. Metal framework would contract in cold, potentially shattering the glass it held. The weight of snow on a glass roof would collapse the structure. The entire concept contradicted basic frontier building wisdom, which held that solid walls and small windows conserved heat better than large expanses of transparent material. Arvid did not argue. Instead, he presented calculations. He showed thermal mass equations and heat retention estimates. He explained how solar gain during even weak winter sun would warm the airspace between cabin and glass. He described how plants and soil would store that warmth and release it overnight. He detailed how wind protection alone would reduce heat loss by measurable degrees. Torsten was not convinced by the theory, but he recognized the care in Arvid's preparation. The real persuasion came from Arvid's silver. He offered to pay 3 times Torsten's normal rate for the metalwork. The amount was substantial, representing most of what Arvid had saved from 3 years of trapping. For a blacksmith operating on thin margins, the offer was difficult to refuse. Torsten agreed, but with conditions. He would fabricate the framework in sections, and if at any point he determined the design was structurally unsound, he would stop work. Arvid would accept the blacksmith's judgment on all matters of metal integrity. Arvid accepted these terms. The work began in mid-September and continued into November. Torsten worked methodically, heating iron stock in his forge and hammering it into posts and beams. Each piece required multiple heating cycles and precise measurements. Arvid visited the forge every few days to inspect progress and make minor adjustments to specifications. Torsten never warmed to the project, but his craftsmanship was excellent. The metalwork emerged from his shop with clean joints and accurate dimensions. Other settlers who saw the fabrication asked Torsten what he was building. He told them truthfully, framework for a glass structure to surround Arvid Lund's cabin. The mockery spread further. Men who came to have horses shod made jokes about glass houses and crazy widowers. Torsten did not defend Arvid, but he did not join the mockery either. He simply completed the work he had been paid to do. Ivar Solberg had built 17 cabins in the Montana Territory over 12 years of frontier carpentry. He understood log construction with the certainty of repetition. Notch the corners, stack the logs, chink the gaps, frame the door and window, raise the roof. The method had survived generations because it worked. A competent man could build a serviceable cabin in 4 to 6 days. The structure would shelter its occupants adequately if maintained properly. This was proven knowledge, tested by time and survival. When word spread that Arvid Lund was building a glass enclosure around his cabin, Ivar's response was immediate and public. He declared the project foolish during a gathering at the small settlement store where trappers and homesteaders collected mail and supplies. Glass, Ivar explained to anyone who would listen, was the opposite of insulation. Glass let cold see you shiver. Glass shattered when temperature dropped fast. Glass required constant maintenance and offered no structural strength. A man would be warmer wrapping his cabin in blankets than in glass panels. Ivar's criticism carried weight in the community. He was skilled at his trade and had no reputation for exaggeration. When Ivar said something would not work, people listened. He expanded his critique beyond the technical to the personal. Arvid's mind had been damaged by war, Ivar suggested. The loss of his wife had pushed him into irrationality. The glass project was grief expressing itself as delusion. A man in his right mind would remarry, rebuild his life, accept that death was part of frontier existence. Instead, Arvid was wasting money on an elaborate memorial that would fail at the first hard freeze. Others joined the mockery. Thomas Hewitt suggested that Arvid was building a display case for his loneliness. Knut Berge, a tradesman who traveled between settlements, spread the story of the glass folly to wider audiences. Even Edvard Strand, the minister who had presided over Sigrid's burial, expressed concern that Arvid was not grieving in healthy ways. The consensus was clear. Arvid had lost perspective. The proper response was to let him fail and learn. Arvid heard the criticism. The valley's population was small enough that gossip traveled efficiently. He made no effort to defend himself or explain his reasoning. The physics were sound. The calculations were correct. Arguments would not change minds. Only results would matter. He continued working on his foundation, digging a trench around his cabin's perimeter and setting stones to create a level base for the metal framework. Halvor Dahl visited Arvid's site in late October, ostensibly to borrow a tool but actually to observe the construction. He watched Arvid fitting glass panels into the metal framework, sealing joints with tar and oakum. Halvor asked how much money Arvid had spent on the project. Arvid told him. The amount made Halvor wince. For that money, Halvor said, Arvid could have built 2 standard cabins or purchased enough firewood to last 3 winters. Arvid nodded acknowledgment but offered no defense. Halvor left shaking his head, convinced he had witnessed foolishness that would end in expensive failure. August 1882 marked the beginning of physical construction. Arvid had spent weeks studying the ground around his cabin, observing water drainage during rains and noting frost patterns from the previous winter. He selected a perimeter 8 feet from his cabin walls, creating a buffer that would allow adequate space for planting beds and human movement while keeping the structure's footprint manageable. The foundation work began with digging. Arvid excavated a trench 6 inches deep around the entire perimeter, creating a rectangular outline that measured 32 feet by 24 feet. The soil was rocky, typical of Montana hillsides, and the work progressed slowly. He used a mattock to break ground and a shovel to remove loosened soil. Each day he completed 10 to 12 feet of trench. The complete perimeter took 9 days to excavate. He filled the trench with stones collected from a creek bed half a mile away. The stones were river rock, rounded by water and ranging from fist-sized to larger than his head. He hauled them by wheelbarrow, making dozens of trips over several days. The stones were set carefully, largest ones first to create a stable base, smaller ones filling gaps between. He finished the stone foundation with a layer of gravel that he tamped down until it was level and firm. The metal framework arrived from Torsten Vick's forge in mid-September. Arvid transported the pieces using his wagon, making 4 trips to move corner posts, horizontal beams, roof supports, and connecting hardware. Each corner post weighed approximately 60 pounds and stood 9 feet tall. The horizontal beams were 8 feet long and weighed 40 pounds each. Arvid laid out all the pieces near his cabin, organizing them by function and checking each piece against his drawings. Setting the corner posts required precision. Arvid dug holes 18 inches deep at each corner of his foundation perimeter, then positioned the posts vertically. He used a plumb line to ensure they stood exactly perpendicular to the ground. Once satisfied with alignment, he packed stones and gravel around each post base, tamping the fill material until the posts would not shift. The process took 2 full days for all 4 corners. The horizontal beams connected to corner posts through mortise joints Torsten had fabricated. Arvid fitted the beams into place, tapping them with a wooden mallet until the joints seated fully. Iron pins driven through pre-drilled holes locked the connections. The framework began taking shape, a geometric skeleton around his cabin that drew curious stares from occasional visitors. By early October, the basic frame stood complete. 4 corner posts supported horizontal beams at 3 heights, 2 feet, 5 feet, and 8 feet from the ground. Additional vertical supports filled the spaces between corners, creating panels approximately 4 feet wide. The roof framework angled up from the 8-foot horizontal beams to a ridge beam that ran the length of the structure 10 feet above ground. The skeleton was sturdy, immovable when Arvid tested it with his full weight. Now came the delicate work of installing glass. Installing glass panels required care that contradicted Arvid's military training. As a sharpshooter, he had learned to move deliberately but quickly. Speed often meant survival. Glass installation demanded the opposite approach. Each panel required patient fitting, careful sealing, and methodical verification that it would not crack under stress. Haste would waste panels he could not replace. Arvid began with the north wall, reasoning that this side received least sun exposure and would teach him technique on the least critical surface. Each panel fit between vertical subpétitions, metal supports resting on horizontal beams with metal clips holding the glass in place. The clips had been fabricated by Torsten with slight flex to accommodate expansion and contraction. Arvid fitted the first panel, tightened the clips, and stepped back to examine his work. The panel held securely. He applied tar to the joints where glass met metal, using a small brush to work the sealant into every gap. Over the tar he packed oakum, teased hemp fiber that compressed into joints and expanded slightly as it absorbed moisture. The combination created a seal that was flexible but weatherproof. The first panel took 3 hours to install completely. Arvid knew he needed to improve his speed. He had 120 panels to install. By the end of the first week, he had placed 16 panels on the north wall. His technique improved with repetition. He learned to judge the correct clip tension by feel and to apply tar efficiently without excess. Still, progress was slower than anticipated. Each panel required individual attention. Some fit perfectly, others needed minor adjustments, filing metal clips or shimming the panel position with thin strips of wood. Several panels showed hairline cracks that Arvid had not noticed during salvage. These he set aside, unusable. The west wall presented new challenges. This side received afternoon sun, and Arvid noticed that tar softened in direct heat, sometimes running before it set properly. He adjusted his schedule, working on sun-facing walls during morning hours when air was cool. Afternoons he spent on the shaded east wall. The adaptation helped, but added time to the overall project. In late October, disaster struck. Arvid was installing a panel on the south wall when his hand slipped on tar-slicked glass. The panel twisted in its clips, stress concentrated at one corner, and a crack propagated across the entire surface with a sound like a musket shot. The panel was ruined. Arvid set it aside and continued, working. 2 days later, another panel cracked during installation when he over-tightened a clip. Then a third panel shattered when he dropped it while removing it from storage. 3 panels lost meant 3 sections of wall that would require alternative solutions. Arvid had no backup glass. He could not travel to more abandoned homesteads before winter arrived. He made the decision to fill the gaps with canvas stretched on wooden frames, the same solution he planned for the entry door. Canvas was not transparent, but it would block wind and provide some insulation. It was compromise born of necessity. By mid-November, 98 glass panels were installed. The structure was nearly enclosed, and Arvid could see how it would function. On sunny days, even with temperatures near freezing outside, the air between cabin and glass warmed noticeably. The space felt different, sheltered in ways his cabin alone never had. November 1882 brought early snow and temperatures that settled into the 20s at night. Most settlers were finishing preparations for winter, stacking firewood, and securing livestock shelters. Arvid was hauling soil. His neighbors, already convinced of his irrationality, found this new behavior even more bizarre. The man with the glass cage was now filling it with dirt, like he planned to farm indoors through winter. Arvid's reasoning was precise. Thermal mass required material that could absorb and store heat. Water was ideal, but impractical in a space where freezing was possible. Soil and stone were the next best options. He needed substantial mass in the space between his cabin and the glass walls to capture daytime solar gain and release it slowly overnight. Plants would serve a secondary purpose, generating oxygen and regulating humidity, but the primary function was thermal storage. He built raised beds along the north, east, and west walls. Each bed was constructed from split logs, 2 feet wide and 1 foot deep, filled with soil he excavated from a south-facing hillside, where drainage was good and composition was loamy. The beds ran the length of each wall, creating a continuous planting area. The south wall, which received maximum sun, he left mostly clear to allow light penetration, but he placed several large stones in this area specifically for their thermal mass. The soil alone weighed several tons once all beds were filled. Arvid transported it by wheelbarrow, making trips that numbered in the hundreds over 2 weeks. Other settlers who saw him working asked what crops he intended to grow. He explained that he was planting cold, hardy vegetables and herbs that would survive in cool conditions and contribute to the thermal environment. Halvardal laughed openly at this explanation. Plants did not produce heat. Plants needed heat to survive. Arvid was confusing cause and effect, Halvor said. The mockery spread further. Arvid planted in late November, working quickly before the ground in his beds could freeze. He selected species known for cold tolerance. Kale could survive temperatures well below freezing. Certain varieties of lettuce remained viable in cool conditions. Herbs like thyme and oregano went dormant, but did not die. He was not expecting significant growth. He simply needed living plants to complete the system he had designed. The planting was functional rather than agricultural. He spaced plants to maximize soil coverage, creating a green layer that would eventually fill the beds. He watered sparingly, knowing that excess moisture in cold conditions could cause rot. Within days, the greenhouse space had transformed from empty construction to something resembling an indoor garden, though its purpose had nothing to do with food production. By early December, the structure was functionally complete. Glass panels enclosed 3 walls and most of the 4th. The roof was partially covered, with canvas filling gaps where glass was unavailable. The door system consisted of 2 entries, an outer door in the glass wall and his existing cabin door, creating an airlock that minimized heat loss when entering or exiting. The planted beds lined the walls, soil dark and rich against the snow visible through the glass. Arvid stood inside the greenhouse space one evening as temperatures dropped toward 0. The air here was cold, but noticeably warmer than outside, perhaps 15 degrees difference. His breath did not fog as heavily. The wind that howled outside was completely blocked. The innovation was incomplete but functional. The real test would come when deep cold arrived. December 1882 through January 1883 provided moderate winter conditions. Temperatures dropped into the single digits at night, sometimes reaching 5 or 10 below 0 during the coldest stretches, but never approaching the extreme cold that had killed Sigrid the previous year. Snow fell regularly but not excessively. The weather was typical Montana. Winter, challenging but not catastrophic. Arvid documented everything. He placed thermometers at multiple locations, outside the greenhouse, inside the greenhouse, but outside his cabin, and inside his cabin near the fire. He recorded readings 3 times daily and noted firewood consumption. The data accumulated into a clear picture of how his thermal envelope performed. On nights when exterior temperature reached 0 degrees, the greenhouse space maintained temperatures between 15 and 20 degrees. The 10 to 15 degree difference came purely from solar gain absorbed during the day and radiated back by soil and stone overnight. Inside his cabin, with a small fire burning, interior temperature held at 55 to 60 degrees. He burned approximately half the firewood he had consumed the previous winter to maintain comparable comfort. The reduction in fuel consumption was significant, but not dramatic enough to convince skeptics. Halvor Dahl, who visited once in January, ostensibly to borrow tools, examined the thermometers and dismissed the results. Saving firewood was useful, Halvor admitted, but hardly worth the expense and effort Arvid had invested. A man could simply cut more wood rather than build an elaborate glass structure. The math did not justify the innovation unless conditions became extreme. Other settlers shared this assessment. Ivar Solberg pointed out that the winter was mild. "Wait for real cold," Ivar said. "Wait for sustained temperatures below zero, for weeks of -20 or colder. Then the glass would show its weakness. Glass conducted heat away from the cabin. Glass cracked in temperature stress. Glass provided no real insulation. The structure might be performing adequately now, but genuine winter would expose its failure." Arvid did not argue. He continued his documentation and observed how his system functioned. The plants in the beds remained alive, though growth was minimal. The kale showed no frost damage even when greenhouse temperatures dropped to 15 degrees. The herbs went dormant but stayed green. The soil in the beds absorbed warmth during sunny days and released it at night, exactly as calculated. The physics were working as designed. He noticed details that suggested improvements for future iterations. The canvas panels he had used to fill gaps where glass was unavailable performed poorly compared to glass. They provided wind blocking, but no solar gain. If he built another structure, he would ensure adequate glass for complete coverage. The door airlock system worked well, but he could improve the seal around his cabin door to prevent interior heat from escaping into the greenhouse space when he opened it. By late February, as winter began releasing its grip, Arvid had proof that his design functioned. The proof was modest, nothing dramatic, but it was real. He had reduced fuel consumption measurably. His living space was more comfortable than the previous winter. The plants had survived conditions that would have killed them outside. The innovation worked, but the test had been too mild to provide convincing demonstration. Spring 1883 brought Thaw and Arvid's first attempt at sharing his knowledge. The winter had proven his thermal envelope concept functionally sound, and he believed others might benefit from the technique. His approach was direct and without expectation of gratitude. He simply recognized that the innovation could prevent deaths similar to Sigrid's if others adopted it. Halvor Dahl was the logical first contact. The Dahl family lived closest to Arvid's homestead, and Halvor had witnessed the greenhouse cabin's performance firsthand during his January visit. Arvid approached him in early April while Halvor was repairing his fence line. Arvid offered to help Halvor build a similar structure, explaining that he had refined his techniques and could guide construction that would avoid the mistakes he had made. Halvor's refusal was polite but firm. He appreciated the offer, but saw no need for such elaborate construction. His cabin was adequate. Yes, it consumed considerable firewood in winter, but wood was available for the effort of cutting it. The expense of glass and metal framework seemed unjustifiable when traditional methods sufficed. Besides, Halvor added, his cabin had been built by his father using methods passed down through generations. Those methods had kept his family alive. That was sufficient validation. Arvid accepted the refusal without argument. He had anticipated skepticism. Changing behavior required either clear necessity or dramatic demonstration. Moderate winter conditions had provided neither. He tried a different approach with Ivar Solberg, the carpenter whose criticism had been most vocal. Arvid found Ivar at the settlement store and simply asked if Ivar was interested in learning the construction techniques. Perhaps Ivar could offer the service to others who wanted greenhouse cabins built. Ivar's response was colder than Halvor's. He had no interest in building impractical structures that wasted clients' money. His reputation depended on solid construction using proven methods. He would not associate himself with experimental designs that contradicted basic frontier wisdom. Glass belonged in windows, not surrounding entire cabins. If Arvid wanted to live in his glass cage, that was his choice. Ivar would continue building structures that actually worked. Knut Berge, the traveling tradesman, showed mild interest. He asked detailed questions about costs and construction time. Arvid provided honest answers. The materials were expensive if purchased new, but could be salvaged from abandoned homesteads. The construction time was substantial, requiring 3 to 4 months of dedicated work. Knut listened carefully, thanked Arvid for the information, and never mentioned the subject again. By midsummer, Arvid understood that voluntary adoption would not occur. The community had decided his innovation was eccentric rather than practical. Without a crisis to demonstrate clear superiority, traditional methods would persist. People built the way they had always built because change required justification they did not yet possess. Arvid returned to his trap lines and his solitary routine. The knowledge remained available if anyone wanted it, but he would not push further. Fall 1883 found Arvid expanding his greenhouse system based on winter observations. He had identified weaknesses during the previous cold season and now had time to address them. The work was methodical, driven by engineering precision rather than urgency. He did not know that he was preparing for conditions that would validate everything he had built. The canvas panels that filled gaps where glass was unavailable had performed poorly. They blocked wind but provided no solar gain and actually conducted heat away from the greenhouse space through direct contact with cold air. Arvid replaced them with double-layer canvas treated with linseed oil. The treatment made the fabric more weather-resistant and created a small air gap between layers that improved insulation. The modification was imperfect, but better than the original solution. He added more thermal mass. Additional stones were placed strategically around the south wall, where sunlight penetration was greatest. He expanded the planting bed slightly and added more soil, increasing the total mass available to store heat. The calculations suggested that each additional 100 pounds of thermal mass would extend the overnight heat retention by approximately 1 degree-hour. The improvements were incremental but measurable. The roof received attention. Snow load during the previous winter had been manageable, but Arvid recognized that heavier accumulation could stress the glass panels. He added additional support beams to the roof framework, reducing the span between supports and distributing weight more evenly. The modification required purchasing new lumber and spending several days on carpentry work, but the structural integrity improved substantially. The door system was refined. Arvid built a small vestibule entry that extended from the outer glass wall, creating a more effective airlock. The vestibule was 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, large enough for a person to enter, close the outer door, then open the inner door without allowing direct wind penetration. The modification reduced heat loss during entries and exits by an amount that would prove significant during sustained cold. He increased his firewood supply. Despite the efficiency of his thermal envelope, wood remained necessary for heating. He cut and stacked 8 cords, double his previous winter's consumption. The extra supply was insurance against unexpectedly cold conditions or structural failures that might reduce the greenhouse's effectiveness. The work took most of September, but winter survival justified the effort. By late October, the greenhouse cabin was as refined as Arvid's knowledge and resources allowed. The structure stood ready for another winter, stronger and more efficient than its first iteration. The plants in the beds were well established now, their root systems spread through the soil. The thermal mass was substantial. The insulation was improved. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Arvid watched early November snow with the satisfaction of readiness. His trap lines were set, his food stores were adequate. His cabin was warm, and his fuel supply was generous. He expected a winter similar to the previous year, perhaps slightly colder. nothing he could not manage with the systems he had built. Weather patterns, however, were preparing something far more severe than expectation. January 1884 began with normal winter conditions. Temperatures stayed in the teens during the day, dropping to 0 or slightly below at night. Snow fell intermittently, accumulating to depths of 18 inches in areas where wind allowed it to settle. The valley's settlers maintained their routines, feeding livestock, hauling water, burning firewood at rates they had calculated based on previous winters. Nothing suggested the catastrophe that was forming. The shift began on January 9th. A high-pressure system settled over the northern Rockies, bringing air that had originated in the Arctic and descended without modification. Temperatures dropped 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. By the evening of January 10th, thermometers throughout the valley read -20. By midnight, -30. The cold deepened, with a quality that went beyond simple measurement. The air became hostile, burning exposed skin in seconds and turning breath to ice crystals before it could dissipate. January 11th brought -35. Wood smoke from cabin chimneys rose straight up in the still air, columns of white against gray sky. Inside their cabins, settlers burned wood at frantic rates, trying to maintain interior temperatures above freezing. Fires that had previously consumed one log every 2 hours now required constant feeding. The cold penetrated through chinking gaps, through door frames, through roofs despite layers of sod. Cabins built using standard methods were being overwhelmed. The wind arrived on January 12th. Not the steady wind of normal winter storms, but gusts that struck with physical force, driving temperatures toward -45, with wind chill approaching -60. Snow that had been falling lightly became a blizzard that reduced visibility to arm's length. The combination of extreme cold and wind created conditions that defeated normal survival strategies. Fires could not burn hot enough to compensate for heat loss. Firewood consumption exceeded supply rates. Families huddled in their cabins, burning furniture, burning anything that would combust, watching interior. Temperatures dropped despite desperate efforts. Halvor Dahl's cabin held 42 degrees on the morning of January 13th, despite a fire that consumed wood faster than he could split it. By afternoon, the interior temperature was 38. By evening, 34. His children wore every piece of clothing they owned and still shivered under blankets. Birgit tried to keep them calm, but fear was becoming rational. The cabin that had sheltered them for 6 years was failing. The cold was winning. Other families experienced similar deterioration. Ivar Solberg's cabin, built with his own carpenter's precision, could not maintain 40 degrees. Thomas Hewitt burned through his entire month's firewood supply in 3 days. Edvard Strand, the minister, prayed while watching ice form on his interior walls despite a roaring fire. The community that had mocked Arvid's innovation now faced the reality that their traditional methods were inadequate against conditions that, while extreme, were not unprecedented on the Montana frontier. 300 yards from the Dahl cabin, Arvid sat comfortably in his greenhouse-wrapped structure. The exterior temperature read -43. Inside the greenhouse space, the temperature held at -8. Inside his cabin, with a small fire burning, the interior maintained 65 degrees. He wore a single wool shirt and felt no discomfort. The crisis reached its peak on the evening of January 13th. Halvor Dahl's fire went out. The wood he had been burning was green, inadequately seasoned, and the extreme cold prevented it from catching properly. He had matches, but could not generate enough heat to ignite the damp wood. The fire that had been struggling to maintain marginal warmth simply died, leaving the family in a cabin that was 31 degrees and dropping rapidly. Birgit understood immediately that they could not survive the night. Children could not withstand sustained exposure to temperatures below freezing, especially with wind driving cold through every gap in the cabin's construction. She made the decision without consulting Halvor, whose pride had prevented him from seeking help earlier. She wrapped her youngest child in blankets, told her two older children to put on every piece of clothing they owned, and headed for the door. Halvor tried to stop her. Going outside in these conditions was suicide. The distance to Arvid's cabin was only 300 yards, but in blizzard conditions with visibility near zero and temperatures that killed exposed flesh in minutes, it might as well have been 3 miles. Birgit ignored him. Staying meant watching their children freeze. Moving meant a chance. She opened the door and stepped into conditions that stole her breath immediately. The wind hit with physical force. Snow drove horizontally, ice particles that stung any exposed skin. Birgit could barely see 10 feet ahead. She knew the direction to Arvid's cabin from memory, having walked the path dozens of times in normal conditions. Now she simply moved forward, holding her youngest tight, calling to her older children to stay close. The cold penetrated through layers of clothing within seconds. Her face burned. Her lungs ached with each breath. She saw the glow before she saw the structure. Light from Arvid's cabin filtered through the greenhouse glass, creating a golden presence in the white chaos of the storm. The sight gave her direction and hope. She pushed forward, her children following, until her hand touched glass. The outer door was obvious, darker frame against transparent panels. She found the handle and pulled. Warmth hit her face like a physical thing. The vestibule Arvid had built created an airlock, and even this small enclosed space was 40 degrees warmer than the exterior. Birgit stood there for a moment, her children pressing against her, all of them gasping at the temperature difference. Then the inner door opened, and Arvid stood there, backlit by his cabin's fire, his expression showing no surprise. He stepped aside without speaking. Birgit entered the greenhouse space where plants grew in beds along the walls, and the air temperature was perhaps 5 degrees, still freezing, but survivable compared to outside. Then Arvid opened his cabin door and gestured them inside. The interior was warm, in ways Birgit had almost forgotten existed. 60 degrees, perhaps 65. Her youngest began crying, not from cold now, but from the shock of warmth after prolonged exposure to hostile temperatures. Arvid closed the doors and returned to his fire. He added a single log, the only acknowledgement that his fuel consumption had increased with additional occupants. Within 2 hours of the Dahl family's arrival, 3 more families appeared at Arvid's greenhouse door. Ivar Solberg came with his wife and teenage son, their faces showing frostbite damage despite the short journey from their cabin 400 yards away. Thomas Hewitt arrived, alone, his family having left for relatives in town the previous week. Edvard Strand brought his elderly mother, who could barely walk and whose lips had turned blue from cold exposure. Arvid admitted them all without comment. His cabin, designed for 1 person, now held 11. The space was crowded but manageable. People sat on his floor, leaned against walls, occupied his sleeping platform and his single chair. The small fire that had been adequate for Arvid alone now served the entire group. Yet the interior temperature remained stable at 62 degrees. The greenhouse envelope trapped enough residual heat that the fire's contribution was supplementary rather than primary. No one spoke about the mockery. No one mentioned the 18 months of ridicule Arvid had endured while building this structure. The families simply occupied the space, warming themselves, checking children and elderly for frostbite damage, gradually accepting that they would survive the night. Birgit Dahl prepared what food people had brought, creating a communal meal from bread and dried meat. Arvid contributed venison from his stores. Through the glass walls, the blizzard remained visible, a white fury that rendered the world beyond the greenhouse uninhabitable. Inside, children gradually stopped shivering. Adults removed outer layers of clothing as their bodies adjusted to warmth. Conversation resumed in quiet tones, careful and mundane, avoiding the obvious subject of why they were here and what had been proven. Halvor Dahl finally addressed it. He stood near the fire, looked at Arvid, and spoke words that came with visible difficulty. He had been wrong about the greenhouse cabin. He had mocked something he did not understand. His pride had nearly killed his family. If Arvid was willing, Halvor would like to learn how to build a structure like this. He would pay whatever the instruction cost. He would work however long it took. He simply wanted his family to be safe next winter. Arvid's response was brief. He would help Halvor build a greenhouse cabin. There would be no payment. The knowledge was free to anyone who wanted it. Construction would begin after spring thaw. That was all that needed to be said. Halvor nodded and sat down. The conversation moved to other topics. The night passed slowly. People slept in shifts, sharing blankets and floor space. Arvid maintained his fire with the same small logs he always used, adding fuel every 2 hours. By morning, the blizzard had not diminished, but the interior of the greenhouse cabin remained stable. 11 people had survived conditions that would have killed them in standard cabins. The validation was complete, undeniable, written in the simple fact of continued breathing. The extreme cold persisted for 6 more days. Temperatures remained below -30, occasionally spiking to -45 during the worst hours. Families rotated between Arvid's greenhouse cabin and brief returns to their own structures to feed livestock and retrieve supplies. Each return journey was dangerous. Each departure from Arvid's warmth into the hostile exterior reinforced the difference between adequate shelter and superior engineering. On January 20th, the weather finally broke. Temperatures rose to -10, then 0, then climbed into the teens. The blizzard ended. Visibility returned. The valley's settlers emerged from survival mode to assess damage. Livestock had died despite shelter. Food stores had been consumed at unsustainable rates. Firewood supplies were depleted. Several cabins showed structural damage from the extreme cold, chinking that had cracked and failed, door frames that had warped, roof supports that had shifted under heavy snow load. The families who had sheltered in Arvid's cabin returned to their homes with new understanding. They had experienced directly what engineering precision could accomplish. They had felt the temperature differential between traditional construction and thermal envelope design. The difference was not theoretical. It was the difference between survival and crisis, between comfort and desperation, between adequate and superior. Halvor Dahl approached Arvid 3 days after the thaw. His request was simple. He wanted help building a greenhouse enclosure around his cabin. He had salvage locations identified where he could collect glass. He would purchase metal framework from Torsten Wieck or fabricate it himself if necessary. He would invest whatever time the construction required. He needed this protection for his family. Pride no longer mattered. Arvid agreed and began planning Halvor's structure. Within a week, Ivar Solberg made a similar request. The carpenter who had been most vocal in his criticism now wanted to learn the techniques he had dismissed. Arvid agreed again. Then Thomas Hewitt asked. Then 3 other settlers who had not sheltered in Arvid's cabin but had heard about the temperature measurements and survival outcomes. The requests accumulated faster than Arvid could accommodate. He helped Halvor first, working through spring and early summer, to build a greenhouse enclosure that mirrored Arvid's design with minor improvements based on lessons learned. The construction took 11 weeks. Other settlers watched the progress and asked questions. Arvid answered everything freely. He shared his calculations, his material sources, his techniques for glass installation and thermal mass placement. The knowledge that had been mocked now spread through the community as men recognized its value. By fall 1884, 4 greenhouse cabins stood in the valley. By spring 1885, 7. The construction method that Arvid had developed alone, driven by grief and engineering logic, was becoming the preferred approach for settlers who wanted reliable winter shelter. No one called them glass follies anymore. They called them Lund cabins, or thermal envelopes, or simply the warm structures. The innovation had moved from mockery to adoption in the span of one catastrophic freeze. Winter 1889 arrived with familiar cold but no catastrophe. Temperatures dropped to -20, stayed there for weeks, rose briefly, then fell again. The pattern was normal Montana winter, challenging but manageable. Throughout the valley, 13 homesteads now featured greenhouse-wrapped cabins. The structures glowed at night like lanterns scattered across the hillsides, their glass walls catching firelight and moonlight, marking human presence in wilderness darkness. Arvid stood outside his cabin on a clear February evening, watching those distant lights. 5 years had passed since the freeze that validated his design. The community that had mocked him now lived because they had copied him. The technique had spread beyond his valley to neighboring settlements. Trappers and homesteaders traveling through the region carried stories of cabins that stayed warm, with minimal fuel, of structures that transformed winter from survival challenge to manageable season. He walked to Sigrid's grave, as he did every few weeks. The site was on a hillside overlooking his cabin, marked by stones he had carefully arranged and maintained. Snow covered the ground, but the grave remained visible, a quiet presence he visited when solitude required acknowledgement of what had been lost. He stood there in the cold, his breath forming clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. The innovation that had consumed him after Sigrid's death had taken a trajectory he had not anticipated. He had built the greenhouse cabin to solve a personal problem, to create shelter that would not fail, as his original cabin had failed. He had not intended to change how people built or to create a legacy that would outlast him. Yet here it stood, reproduced across the landscape, sheltering families who would otherwise struggle through winters that killed the unprepared. Other settlers respected him now, though the respect was quiet and expressed through actions rather than words. They asked his advice on construction problems. They invited him to community gatherings. They included him in decisions about valley development. He remained solitary by preference, but the isolation was no longer enforced by others' judgment. He had proven something they could not dismiss, and that proof had altered his social position permanently. Torsten Wieck, the blacksmith who had been skeptical of the original project, now fabricated metal frameworks as a standard service. He had refined the designs and could produce a complete framework in 3 weeks rather than the 2 months the first one had required. Ivar Solberg, the carpenter, had become an advocate for greenhouse construction, teaching the techniques to others and building structures throughout the territory. The knowledge Arvid had developed in isolation had become communal property, improved and distributed by others who recognized its value. Arvid returned to his cabin as full darkness settled. Inside, the temperature held at 64 degrees with a fire that would burn through the night on 4 logs. The plants in his greenhouse beds were dormant but alive, waiting for spring sun to trigger growth. The structure that had seemed impossible 5 years earlier was now proven, practical, and replicated. Sigrid's death had led to this. Engineering had transformed grief into something that sheltered others. The impossible had become routine, built into logs and glass across the Montana frontier.